Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Before we head into our final keynote conversation, I am so excited to announce our third fabulous panel of the day called Conditions of a Changing Environment, Impact on Africa's Youth, moderated by my junior fellow, Tani Washington, a junior fellow in Carnegie's Africa program, which will feature Sarah Yerkes, Tonija Hope Navas, and Ebelechukwu Monye.
All the way down, and then I'll follow you guys. All right, good afternoon and welcome back, or welcome if you're just now joining us. My name is Tani Washington and I'm a junior fellow with the Africa program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And today I am joined by three incredible scholars who will be joining us for this wonderful conversation. So immediately to my right is Dr. Sarah Yerkes, who is a senior fellow with the Middle East program at Carnegie. Her work focuses on democracy and governance and US foreign policy towards the Middle East and North Africa. She works on geopolitical issues, particularly pertaining to North Africa and the Middle East region, and youth issues in Tunisia as well. Directly to her right is Dr. Tonija Hope, who is the director of the Ralph J. Bunche International Center at Howard University, where she oversees the center's vision, engagements, partnerships, and programming, as well as flagship federal programming. Dr. Hope is actively engaged in a variety of initiatives to promote racial equity throughout the African diaspora, and we're incredibly thrilled to have her. And then to her right is Ebelechukwu Monye, who is a storyteller and a development specialist with several years of research experience in financial inclusion, digital access, and youth and education policies, and also in a former life worked in the Africa program at Carnegie. So we're happy to have you back. Before we start this conversation, I want to recognize the importance and significance of this panel, not just having these wonderful scholars up here, but also that this wonderful panel of scholars is entirely made of women, which, yeah, absolutely, yes. Which I think is incredibly important, not only because of representation on the continent and in the diaspora, but also because when we talk about issues dealing with youth in Africa and the youth boom on the continent, we know that these global issues will be exponentially harder for women and girls. There's a specific statistic that was recently stated by the Economic Commission for Africa, in which states that none of the targets for the UN Sustainable Development Goals have been met, or are even on track to be met by 2050 or 2036, which are the two goals that the UN has specified. So we're talking about issues like economic access, educational opportunity, and gender-based violence, which by 2036 and 2050, these issues that affect half the continent won't even have been addressed properly. So I want to ask, based on your experience collectively in academia, in development, in democracy and governance spaces, how have you seen these issues that you're working on collectively, how have you seen them contributing to this problem of women and girls and their educational, economic, and gender-based violence issues not being addressed properly? Do we have anyone who wants to go first, or I can start with Sarah?
Sure, thank you so much. It's great to be here, and a big applause to the junior fellows. I have the opportunity to work with them here at Carnegie, and so impressed with what you guys have pulled off. But yeah, I think there's a couple of issues that are really important that kind of impact everything and everyone, but have an even bigger impact on women and girls. And the first is climate change. I think this is something where we've seen, over time, I work particularly on North Africa, and in the case of North Africa, climate change is not necessarily creating the challenges, but it's exacerbating them. And so when you look at the types of issues and the types of areas that women are often involved in, whether it's agriculture, handicrafts, tourism, these are the areas that are most impacted by climate change. So we're seeing women and girls impacted even more so than men, and men are being impacted as well. A second issue I think that's really important is a lack of political representation. So again, across North Africa, where we see women not necessarily represented, whether it's at the local level or the national level, this means there's less of a woman's voice and that the issues that impact women and girls are not being represented to the same extent as men. And then finally, I think what we really see is a lack of education and implementation around some of the policies and laws that are on the books. So one of the phenomenon that I've looked at quite a bit in the Tunisian case is the difference between de facto and de jure laws and policies. So, on paper, you might have a really great gender-based violence law, but in practicality, in reality, it's not being implemented. And that's due to a variety of factors, whether it's the fact that women are not informed of what their rights are, or judges are not informed of their rights, police are not informed of what the law actually says. And so there's a whole variety of issues that are contributing and really exacerbating all of these issues together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Dr. Hope?
Well, I'm in academia, and so Howard University, for those who are not aware, is 76% female, which is really high. The student body is 76% female, but we've never had a female president at Howard University. And if you take that and expand it across academia, this is my theory, right? You might think that perhaps that might be contributing, much like the lack of political representation, lack of representation in academic leadership across the spectrum of institutions in the United States, but also just globally. I've never done a scan of leadership at universities on the continent, but I would venture to guess that not many of them are led by women. And so, but we are the larger of the two genders, and so I don't know, I think that's something that needs to be addressed in a pretty significant way. And hopefully, because we are such large numbers in universities, that is preparing us to take on those leadership roles. But I think that is kind of a big issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of also goes back to Sarah's point of like the difference between de jure and de facto. There might be these initiatives that push women into schools and into academic spaces, but what's keeping them there and what's bringing them into these leadership positions and what's giving them upward mobility? And it, like you said, there might not be that happening. Ebele?
Sure. In addition to the points that the other two panelists have already raised, I would put the problems under three umbrellas. So the first one will be data, the second one will be policies, and the third one would be experiential evidence. So when it comes to data, it's just simply like either the inavailability or the incompleteness of data that really informs the second point, which is the policies. I personally believe that the policies we make are as effective as the data that informs or influences them. And the final one is experiential evidence, which is also something that the two speakers have already talked a little bit about, which is basically when development professionals go into communities, it's not for us to project what we think the solution is. It's for us to listen to the community, take that contextual evidence and make more context-driven policies that basically help people get to the development goals that they want. And personally, the way that I look at development research is also through the lens of solutions. So what can we do to address these problems? Two things I would say: we need more data libraries, but secondly, we need to employ more qualitative methodology that really allows us to get this contextual evidence. And I also think that sometimes when we look at data from the macroscopic view, it's a little bit difficult to see the gains we have in microscopic areas. And an example is when you talk about like educational outcomes. So UNESCO data shows that we've had about a 5% increase rate in completion rates for lower education girls in Africa, and it's about a 7 percentage point for higher education. So we see that even though on a macro level it seems as though a lot of these goals are missing their mark, there are also a lot of progress, there's a lot of progress being made on the micro level. And then with regards to, what can we do moving along, I would say we have to approach the problems creatively. And there also has to be that collaboration both between the government, private sectors, but also academia. And, one point which the more we have this conversation, maybe we can put more into it is the issue of data. So for instance, in Nigeria where I'm from, a lot of SME businesses are female-led, but then these businesses don't have access to credit. So a good question here would be like, how can we leverage data to make sure that we have better targeting for women like this? So these are some of the angles that come to mind when I think about this question.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to say thank you for adding that point of optimism there, that there is a lot of movement in terms of these sustainable development goals that might not be seen on a macro level or on a micro level, but it's easier to see when we're looking at huge trends across the continent, the diaspora, and across history. So thank you for that point. Going into the idea of evidence and increasing data and these policies, I want to move into our second question, which is more about how have you seen youth adapting to sort of some of these challenges that we talked about? I know we're talking about evidence. Sarah, you've done a lot of specific analytical research in Tunisia on the continent. And so I kind of want to get your perspective on how you've seen, maybe over the last decade or so, how youth have adapted to some of these challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one point of optimism, and I'm always try to be optimistic even when it's challenging. But I do think we've seen, in particular in the case of North Africa, civil society organizations growing dramatically, and a lot of those are led by young people. A lot of those are led by women. But particularly in the space, I mentioned climate change initially. I had the opportunity last year to go to COP. And one of the things that was really impressive to me was seeing the number of young people who were involved in the COP delegations from Morocco and Tunisia. And they were held up as two of the examples globally of countries that were inclusive of younger voices. And I think this really matters, talking about representation, whether it's at the university level, whether it's at the political level, having young people's voices, particularly in the climate sphere, where you're going to be the ones who are most affected by it. No offense to John Kerry, but like an old man he's not going to live to see most of what's happening in climate. Having young people who are there, who are able to actually have their voices heard, make the kind of decisions, and speak to the policymakers to say, look, like this is my life, this is going to be my generation, my children's generation, I think really, really matters. And I think Morocco and Tunisia are both doing a really, really good job. There's still a long way to go. I mean, they're not taken as seriously as their older counterparts, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think that that's something we can sort of look to and sort of help to grow in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, mentioning the civil societies bit is really important. I think sometimes we overlook what civilians and civil society can do over private institutions and nonprofits and things like that. But one of the biggest civil societies, I would say, is one that's overlooked is the diaspora largely, and youth in the diaspora. And so I think I kind of want to go to Dr. Hope on this, because I think Howard is one of the premier institutions when it comes to analyzing how the African diaspora and youth in the African diaspora can navigate challenges. So if you have thoughts on that question.
How youth in the African diaspora are navigating challenges?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of organizing that's going on and trying to connect with youth in other places, building networks. I think social media obviously has been very helpful in connecting people. And so when youth are able to see what other youth in other countries are doing, then they can, maybe we should try that here. So we send students abroad, on study abroad, and a lot of the time, a lot of our students want to go to Western Europe. Obviously, everybody wants to go to Western Europe, but a lot of our students want to go to other places in the diaspora or on the continent and see and be with people that look like them. And so, in those occasions, in those experiences, they are learning from and learning with students that look like them, but maybe don't think like them or have had different experiences from them. And I think that whenever we can help facilitate that kind of an experience for our students, any student, it is only going to help foster the ability to overcome these challenges.
Yeah.
And working together, figuring out how, over here they're doing it this way, maybe we can't do it exactly that way, but maybe we can try it this way over here. And I think at the end of the day, collectively is how all of us, youth and everyone else, if we work more collectively, we will be able to overcome many more challenges.
I love that, yeah. And I think we're going to come back to that collective bit in a little bit when we talk about the Trump administration, which will be a whole nother conversation. But I do want to add Abele into this conversation about comparative analysis. As a data specialist and a development specialist, I'm sure you do a lot of comparative work in terms of, on the continent in U.S., Africa. Have you seen in your work that there's a comparative difference between the way that youth in the diaspora are navigating challenges versus youth on the continent, or how, what does the data say in your line of work?
Sure. So I am a person that loves to put things under umbrellas, as you all will get to find out at some point today. But for this particular in this particular regard, I would say that there are actually similarities in the way that you see the youth in diaspora and the youth in the continent organizing, and I will put them under 3 umbrellas. So the political aspect, business and innovation, but also research. And when you come to politics, you can see parliamentarians like Botswana's Bogolo Kenewendo, and Uganda's Vanessa Nakate, who is a climate activist, who are not only contributing, but also reshaping both political and activist spaces that have historically excluded people like them. When you come to business and innovation, you have youth-led initiatives like PiggyVest, which was co-founded by Odunayo Ewenei in Nigeria. You also have, other initiatives like Flutterwave. And when it comes to research, I know that the Carnegie Africa program is actually at the forefront of plugging in data gaps, like I said before. I don't see Kofi. Oh, I actually see Kofi here. Sorry, I'm trying to have a laser focus. But I see Kofi, and I also see the director of the Africa program. They are really doing a good job at pushing this data gaps. I had the privilege to work on the pilot version of the Africa Technology Regulatory Tracker, which is an example of the way Africa, whether in diaspora or on the continent, are also plugging in their research. But for us, we saw that there was a gap with regards to the fact that there wasn't a one-stop shop to see how African governments were both regulating their digital economies, but also optimizing their economies. And so we created this tracker. So this is one of the examples, all the examples I try to give today are really practical, because I feel like there are so many examples within and outside the continent of just like the African youth staying resilient regardless of, what's going on around them. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And resilience is definitely going to be like the theme of, I think, the next 4 years, unfortunately. So I said we were going to talk about the Trump administration. We are. So I want to get into this idea of you said you work on the African Technology Policy Tracker, which has been launched, and it was incredible, and we're very proud of our team here. But one of the reasons why that was able to happen is because we were able to have wonderful talent from the continent come to the U.S., learn about things, and then apply their knowledge to what they're doing in the U.S. The Trump administration has kind of created a disarray of that structure in a few words. There was an array of mixed emotions in terms of the U.S. stepping away from its commitments to the rest of the world. And in the most recent FY26 budget, there was a proposed $690 million cut for education and cultural exchanges, which reads, quote, "Foreign students receiving technical and high-demand training leave to take their skills overseas, having deprived American students of places to acquire those skills." So I think I want to come first to Dr. Hope in an academic context here, and feel free to be as honest as you want to be. Do you think that this is a time for concern for African youth, the diaspora youth, or do you see that there's a brighter hope for the future of youth on the continent?
Okay, so I think we can all agree that the United States has one of the, if not the best higher education system in the world. However, it's not the only one. And we are making our bed, we're going to have to lay in it. And so if this is the way the administration wants to move forward by limiting or completely excluding the inclusion of people from the continent and any other place where there are melanated people, then we're going to experience the effects of this in the near term. And what is going to end up happening is that African students are going to go to Europe, they're going to go to Australia, they're going to go to Asia, they might go to Russia. And we've seen, Russia has been very successful in educating Black people over the years. I know many people who from Colombia, from Zimbabwe, you name it, have gone and studied in what was the former USSR. But you know what? That's what's going to happen, and the United States is going to be the one that's going to suffer for it. Mm-hmm. So I don't have any problem. I, in fact, encourage them to go elsewhere, because clearly we are not welcoming them. We, meaning the administration. I would love to have our African students come to Howard, to our institutions, but this administration is not making that easy. And in turn is discouraging students. And why would you want to come here at this point? I can't, who are we to blame them? So they're not wanted here. I think they should go where they are wanted, but also recognizing that the continent itself has excellent universities. So I used to work at University of Cape Town, actually, and there were a lot of other students from other parts of the continent at UCT, and go home, come here, get their degree, go home, etc. So African students don't even actually have to leave the continent. I know there's a lot of youth, so maybe there's not enough universities or university spaces for youth, but that could be an area that Africa could invest more in and not necessarily need to send their students outside of the continent. I think this is a period of time where people are going to have to make meaning governments, meaning actual students, will have to make a decision about which direction to go. And I think this is an opportunity for Africa to invest in their institutions, in their universities, because Africa already has great institutions. They can make them greater, keep the talent at home, and then just, give a little, what is the word? What is the look that I'm looking for? Just, kind of just be like, we don't need you anyway.
Yeah.
So I kind of look forward to that moment.
Oh, wow. Okay,
Yeah, sure.
that's good. I think that's a very, I wouldn't say diverging opinion, but I think that's a very refreshing opinion in this climate, which is very interesting. I think I want to hear more. Sarah, do you have thoughts on, given your research, is there a progression of what this deteriorating relationship will do to youth on the continent and the relationship with the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. First of all, I think it is maybe an area from optimism that I hadn't really thought about, that maybe this is an opportunity for institutions outside of the United States to actually strengthen themselves and to keep their own talent. I think that that's good. I wish that it didn't have to be that way, but yeah, I mean, I think overall what I've seen both in research and also from my time in US government is that, this education is a massive form of soft power for the United States, and it's going to be a tremendous loss for the United States to stop being able to use that soft power. One example that I'll give in the Tunisian case, there's a scholarship program that was established right after the Arab Spring. So when Tunisia was going through its democratic transition, they set up a scholarship specifically for Tunisians to come to the US for 1 year. It was called the Thomas Jefferson Scholarship Program. And this was not, for the full 4-year education, but for 1 year they would come to the US, study at a university for a year, and then go back to Tunisia. And it was one of the most effective programs of cultural diplomacy, of education cultural diplomacy that I've ever seen. I mean, it was amazing. Every year I got to meet these students, and first of all, them just coming to, they would study all over the US. So people in Minnesota had never met a Tunisian before. It was really, really beneficial for Tunisia, for them to get to have this interaction with Americans all over the place. But also for the United States, people would come here, they would learn about the United States, it would strengthen our relationships, and then they would go back and use their skills back at home. And I think we kind of forget that. It's not this one-way street. This is an exchange where we are both learning from each other. And that loss, this is an area where I cannot be optimistic. I feel like that loss is really going to be felt profoundly for the United States, not only for our ability to have soft power, but just for our culture, for our ability to kind of learn from each other is really, really sad, frankly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that relationship, obviously it's one that's been building for decades, but even over the last 25 years has significantly increased, and this change is creating such a dynamic shift that I think will be felt for a very, very long time. But Dr. Hope, you mentioned, these students just staying on the continent and just investing in their own infrastructure, education systems, and things like that. I'm not sure that other African leaders tend to feel the same way, which is very interesting. This question is an example of that specifically, that late last year, Kenyan President William Ruto began urging young people who were formally trained or not formally trained to leave the country in search of employment elsewhere due to the lack of employment opportunities in Kenya, specifically going to places like Germany, Russia, like you mentioned, in order to plan further agreements on energy, trade, education, things like that. You mentioned if youth aren't encouraged to go to the U.S., they're going to go to these other places. And if the U.S. continues on the path it's going, that might be the trajectory for the next however long. I guess, what are the implications in your idea of these African migrants and youth migrants specifically going to these places with their own educational prowess and their ideas, their thoughts, things like that?
I mean, I think it's good for them to go. I can understand there being a lack of employment opportunities and leaders like President Ruto making suggestions like that. But I think, again, this is an opportunity for African leaders, African governments to take a moment to reflect on ways they might consider reinforcing or reimagining opportunities for youth in their countries. How, yes, I think it's always good to have an international experience, no question. If he's looking to, have youth be like ambassadors or liaisons for creating further agreements on a variety of different subjects, I think that's important. I think it's necessary. But I think that it doesn't have to be the only way. It doesn't have to be the only path. So, yes, send students abroad and have them come back. I think that's an important piece to make sure that they come back. But then once they do that, they have the relationships. Like much like this, it sounds like this Tunisian example. What that did for the exchange for both the people from the U.S. and the Tunisians, that Tunisian student now goes back to Tunisia with a network of U.S. Academics, probably business people, et cetera, that they can then build, whether it's they're trying to build a new business, they have a network in the U.S. that they can tap into. Similarly, how President Ruto is suggesting, that's another opportunity for them, whether it's Germany or Russia or what have you. And again, the U.S. is not the only market for Africa, as we know. So the president telling them to go to these other countries is just diversifying their marketplace for what is to come next, because this is what's happening right now is not a good look for us, and it is going to be detrimental to everybody at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So.
I really love your optimism here. Continuously.
I'm trying. I mean, there's really no choice, because this administration doesn't seem to be really moving on this topic. I mean, we saw it in the first administration, and now they're doubling down. And so what we have to do is figure out how over the next 4 years we can turn this into something. Like so my Instagram feed, right, is all of these countries announcing scholarships for international students. Germany, New Zealand, South Korea, et cetera. And I'm sharing it because, if you can't come here, well, I want you to go and get an education somewhere. So here are some countries that are going to make it easier for you. What are we going to do? So, okay.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I want to have some data-driven ideas behind what's happening here. Ebele, do you have any thoughts on this question specifically?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. So in the first place, with regards to, you made a point about, do we think, I'm just going to read it as the question is. So you said, do we think this is a time of concern for African youth, or do we see a brighter hope for the future of the youth on the continent? So in the first place, while the shifts and while the policy shifts have definitely reduced US-based opportunities, like the panelists have already said, there are definitely a plethora of opportunities around the world. But I'd also like to bring attention to some African-based initiatives as well, whether it's with regards to scholarships or entrepreneurial programs that are also empowering Africans within and outside the continent. Examples include the NNPC scholarships based in Nigeria, the Jimovia scholarships. We also have the Tony Elumelu Foundation program, which has been really empowering and encouraging African youths to focus on entrepreneurship. In other global instances, there are also programs like the Chevening scholarships as well as the Commonwealth scholarships, which are all kind of opportunities that Africans can still leverage. And most importantly, I think that there's an important factor that we're forgetting, which is the power of digital. According to GSMA's report, 300 million unique mobile subscribers were onboarded into the African market between, I believe, 2010 to 2023. And what this means is that they have opportunities not just for education, but they also have access to global markets. So these are just some of the ways that the African youth have, in the first place, continued to innovate, even with shifts to policy changes that are also linked to migration. And a good point that has been raised is the symbiotic nature of migration, in the sense that, in the first place, the host communities benefit, but also the people who are going to these communities benefit. And so many examples come to mind. For example, Kenya gave the world its first successful story of how mobile money can work, and there has been a lot of travel both within the continent and outside the continent to really understand the factors that have brought that to play. So in as much as, again, it seems as though the reality is not very optimistic. I think African youth have continued to prove their resilience in kind of like innovating through the chaos, in
Yeah.
quotes. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And we mentioned resilience, that Africans will always be resilient, I guess. And before we move on to the Q&A, I do want to plug, Abella, you mentioned like a whole bunch of scholarships and fellowships and these things. You do have a podcast that helps a lot of graduate
yeah.
students. Did you want to plug that really quickly for accessibility reasons?
Yeah, but this is what, I'm so sorry, I'm going to try to make this real short,
Yeah.
but this is what I say when I talk about kind of like homegrown solutions. And so the podcast is called Grad School Buddy, and the idea of the podcast is really to make academia more accessible. I really strongly believe in the power of data and policy to make lives better for people from communities like mine. And I think that the work that we do will become better if we have a more representative kind of population in the rooms where decisions are made. So please, if you're looking to apply to scholarships, it doesn't matter whether you're African or not. It's a platform for people from all over the world. If you're confused, if you need a friend, a big brother or a big sister, you should definitely tune into the show.
Absolutely.
Thank
Big
you.
sister Abella. I love that. Okay, we are going to move into a little bit of Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. Yeah. And introduce yourself and then have a question.
No, it's all good. I can just talk about it. It's no problem. I appreciate it, though. Hi. Thank you so much for this. Oh. Thank you very much for this. My name is Larson Bukowski. I'm a recent graduate from American University. And at the beginning of this talk, you were all talking about some of the community organizations, some of the civic society or the civil society that's been established across Africa to kind of combat this whole phenomenon of waithood, where there are just a lack of opportunity. I was wondering if we could kind of talk a little bit more about some of the different tactics that are used. I know that we mentioned social media, but is there anything that can be done with like the arts or just kind of creating a coalition in your experiences?
Oh, thank you. I think we're going to get another question and then we'll, if there are, yeah.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie. I'm one of the junior fellows here at Carnegie. I guess I have a question more about not how the United States is affecting Africa, but the lessons that maybe we can take from African youths. I think a lot about sort of political activism and some really great examples coming from different African countries right now. The U.S. is facing a lot of challenges here. What can we learn from young people in Senegal and places like that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we have one question about tactics for combating recent developments, kind of maybe the more avant-garde ones. So creativity, I know, Abella, you're a storyteller, so maybe you can give us some pointers here. And then lessons from Africa to the U.S. Do we want
Okay,
yeah.
so with regards to creative approaches, when I started giving my data examples, I said that a gap Nigerian women currently had was the fact that a lot of them lead SMEs, but they don't have access to credit, for instance. I can give you an example of what a Nigerian has done in that regard, right? So if you check out an initiative called First Check is a female-led angel fund that basically funds female businesses, and this is just one way. The Grad School Buddy podcast I mentioned, that's another way. I think the beauty of the Africa youth, and you can actually tie these two questions together, is the way our beauty is in our diversity. There are people who their focus is on data, is on research. There are people who, through their creativity, whether it's with regards to their YouTube channel, there are so many YouTubers who have shown the other different aspects of different African countries, whether it's with regards to tourism, it's with regards to culture, or it's with regards to food. But just their ability to come together across all these different spectrums is really what I think is also something that we should take away. And their ability to also look at the data and see, okay, from a contextual point of view, what are we really missing? And then directly addressing those issues. Initiatives like the First Check I mentioned, but also PiggyVest, have really been empowering women to save and invest, and it gives them more funds for their businesses to expand. So these are some of the ways and some of the things that I think are really laudable and should be adopted. Yeah.
That's amazing. I love to hear that. I want to tweak the question just slightly for you, Dr. Hope, and say what are the tactics that maybe Howard is using to combat some of these things, Howard students are using to combat these things, or even ways that you are combating these things, if you want to answer either of these questions.
I think our students are always figuring out ways to connect. I feel like the foundation of a lot of this is just relationships. And our students are always organizing. We have like 250 student organizations on campus. Like there's always an organization for whatever the topic or issue is. They're gonna create an organization and they're gonna create programming around it to raise visibility to whatever the subject or topic is. There are, I'm sure all of you are in group me's, right? So there's group me's galore at Howard where that's really, I feel like, where the conversation is happening, is sharing information about what's happening. Oh, we're doing this march tomorrow, or we're having this event tomorrow. Come out, come out, come out. And they're really good about supporting each other, and but also we're in Washington, D.C., so what this environment is providing, and to the extent that I can get them out of this country, they continue to do that in the countries where they are for whether it's a semester or a year or a 10-day faculty-led program. They're looking for who it is they're gonna connect with, how they're gonna connect. So it usually will involve, what's your Instagram? Okay, here's mine. And then boom, even if it's a 5-day trip, they're now connected. They're gonna go home and they're gonna see for, however long they decide to stay connected to this person, what this person is doing in their country. And again, it's this like visibility that I think we maybe take for granted sometimes. You're just scrolling through Instagram and you see a person that you just met and they're like, oh, this is this really cool thing that they're doing. Oh. So our students are really, I think, engaging in that way to connect with other people and build those relationships.
Yeah, definitely. And we have a through line here of tech that keeps coming up. So maybe we'll come back around to tech because the connectivity there I think is like really important. But Sarah, did you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so it's a similar answer to both questions actually, which is we have the Arab Spring in North Africa, which is, kind of obvious, but at the same time, there are some real lessons I think that really apply to the moment we're in right now in the United States. It's kind of troubling, honestly, to look at some of the developments that we're seeing here and how much I can compare them to things that I've seen happen in Tunisia or other parts of North Africa. But I think a couple of the lessons that youth have shown us is the importance of organizing. We've talked about coalition building. That's really, really crucial if you're going to be able to have a big movement. And that's what we saw in the Arab Spring, that groups that normally wouldn't necessarily sit at the same table could come together for a cause. To the question about sort of the like creative means, graffiti is an interesting tactic that we saw utilized quite a bit in the Arab Spring. And then also I think another important piece is organizing outside of the country. And so one of the things that we've seen is in cases where maybe the space is closing, maybe you can't actually form a political party or an NGO, or there's just not really any space for you to operate, that doesn't mean you need to stop. And I think one of the things that we sort of, in this country, we kind of get complacent about, well, what can we do? Just kind of throw our hands up. That hasn't been the case in these countries in North Africa where the situation is quite repressive. If you can't organize at home, you have family or friends who live in another country where maybe the situation is a little bit better. And so you can figure out, build those coalitions and work together to try to organize and get ready for the moment, prepare yourselves for the moment when maybe the situation is a little bit more open and you can operate better there.
Yeah, so we're seeing this through line of connectivity, coalition building, organizing. I love that. I think that just speaks to the connectivity of the diaspora and then also how progress is going in terms of development. I did want to get another question if there was one. Did we have another question? No? Okay, then I'm going to ask about tech, which is the thing that I did want to talk about. In terms of development spaces, I think technology and youth's use of technology is increasing at a rate that is wonderful to see and really cool to see. Ebele, I wanted to ask you specifically, because I think you're really deep into this tech space. Are there any examples of ways that you've seen African youth use technology in like these new, inspiring, digital ways?
So many examples come to mind. I'm like, oh my God, Tani. I think the first one is, what has already been mentioned with regards to organizing, especially. I think there was this big NSAS movement that happened on Twitter, and a lot of people kind of got to understand what was happening on ground, thanks to technologies like Twitter. I also do think that, for me, connectivity, you can't overestimate kind of like the importance of connectivity. there are so many of my friends that I've worked with on projects that are so dear to me across different thematic areas, and I haven't seen them in years. I have one of my closest friends I work with on grad school, buddy. The last time I saw him was in high school. And, you know, like we always tease each other about this because we weren't even we had, you know, little high school rockers between us, and then we became these adults that really are really interested in similar socioeconomic issues. So definitely with regards to connectivity, the ability that it has to connect people across different geographical areas towards a common goal. But also with regards to stuff like financing, I know that in Nigeria, for example, there have been so many times where GoFundMes have been, you know, the little line between life or death, and these are all things that are backed by technology. And of course, a lot of our remittance as Africans is also, it passes through, you know, technological lines and things like that. So that's why I say like the examples are so many, there are so many instances. But most importantly, the area that I am most interested in is research. So just like the power of technology to also connect researchers, I feel both in terms of like the people that we collaborate with on projects, but also people that we never get to meet, but people whose work influence us because we saw a YouTube video about their work or we saw a reel on Instagram and then we went into a rabbit hole. So these are some of the ways that, you know, technology has really been creating real practical change and among the African youth.
Absolutely. And I love that point about having not seen people for like 10 years. My grandmother keeps telling me, come back to Nigeria. I'm like, okay, well, you know, once we get the money to go back, we'll go back. And I haven't seen some of these people in years, but like, you know, the connectivity that keeps us engaged is like amazing. And it's just something that makes me connected to my family there still. I wanted to talk about, you mentioned remittances, and I think that's a really big piece of this puzzle here, due to the fact that remittances is one of the most important generators of wealth on the continent, and one of those obviously comes from the diaspora. So, Dr. Hope, I wanted to bring you into this question about remittances and you know, students going back to the continent, coming back and forth. Have you seen that like development of like in the economic sense has really helped places like Howard or any of these academic institutions, or like what are these academic institutions trying to do to expand their reach diasporically?
Oh, well, I mean, our largest international student body is from Nigeria at Howard, followed closely by, well, we have a lot of international students. Ghana and Nigeria, I think, are largest. If the Caribbean was if Anglophone Caribbean was one country, it would be the next largest. But we also have a lot of students from Nepal. So just our alumni networks are really important in terms of reaching students across the diaspora, Jamaica, Trinidad, Nigeria, Ghana. I'm trying to get us into non-English speaking diaspora, Colombia, Brazil, Panama, Costa Rica. I mean, we do have some students from those countries, but the ability to come from a non-English speaking country to study in the United States in English is difficult, particularly for Afro-descendant communities, populations, because the access to English language education is cost prohibitive in most cases. And therefore, you can't take the TOEFL and then you can't come and it's like a chain reaction, right? But I'm trying to figure out how to overcome that because I think it's transformative when you can have that. But again, this administration is not making it easy. So the university has to think, a lot of universities have to think about how much they're going to invest in their international student recruitment moving forward, at least for the next 4 years, because are you going to invest that money to recruit and then students not be able to get a visa to come here? And so, and as you know, well, maybe you don't know, a lot of universities rely very heavily on international students because international students typically pay more than, non-international students. Not the case at HBCUs, but most other institutions. And so it's, again, we're at a crossroads to think about how are we going to make sure that we have international students, because I think everyone can agree of the value and the richness of having international students on our campuses, but how are we going to do so in this new environment in which it is so difficult?
Yeah.
Everyone is obviously very concerned.
Right, definitely. And I don't know if anyone has any answers for that just now, so that's kind of the space that we're in, unfortunately. Yeah. I wanted to, unless there are questions, please raise your hand or else I will just keep talking. Okay.
pushback.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm one of the junior fellows at Carnegie as well in the American Statecraft program. Just flipping the question on its head a little bit, I was actually curious in the panelists' views on how the rest of the world should actually react to the shifts happening in Africa. So naturally, like we talked about, African youth will make up a very large portion of the world's population by 2050. Nigeria is set to overtake the United States in population by then. And I think that will really reshape both how the world should conduct foreign policy with Africa. We've seen the African Union join the G20, for example. And also just, oh, I'm a little close to it. No, you're good. How it also shape other bastions of power, like Christianity is now being shaped by West Africa. So I'm curious to see how the world is reacting to these shifts in Africa and how Africa will play a larger role social, culturally, religiously, and also in the climate space as well. Thank you.
Interesting. Okay, I think, Sarah, did you want to take that question?
Sure, I can start and hear what others think as well. I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something that we're just starting to sort of understand and grapple with. I mean, one thing I was reading an article this morning about the African Union and the European Union and how they are trying to figure out ways they might cooperate with more recognition that, especially with the United States sort of retreating from the world stage, you know, how can other bodies, international bodies work together? But no, I think it's really important, and within the continent itself too. I mean, it's something that North Africa is trying to figure out too, of how to be more of a bridge between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that's something that's been going on for quite a while, but there's even more of a recognition that North Africa has a role to play on the continent, whether it's diplomatically or in the business space. And so, yeah, again, I just think that there's a lot, we're gonna see this dealt with a lot more, and I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, and we were talking about optimism earlier, so things like how will the world react to Africa? I think that there's a sort of a positive spark there that maybe Abele or Dr. Hope, if you wanted to join in on that.
Okay, so I can go. I think especially with regards to the proliferation of startups like Flutterwave, right? I always like to go from the data or practical example point of view, right? So in the sense where, let's say, startups or even people in academia have to look for alternative places. We've already talked about the fact that opportunities still exist. So how I project, in the first place, like Africa to react is to look for these opportunities where they exist. I personally believe that, you know, like regimes come and go, but communities stay and people stay. And the beautiful thing about people is that we're adaptable. So it goes back to what I said about resilience. In as much as the opportunities might have receded within the US, I think that there's still opportunities for Africans to kind of like go to other places. And you're seeing that with a lot of startups, whether it's with regards to the places they are choosing to register their startups, or it's with regards to the people that they are collaborating with regards to issues like funding or other technical aspects of their project. And with regards to how the world should react to this, I did, like, you know, my fellow panelists have already said it's kind of a free-for-all, in quote, grab. I think the most important thing is for us as people within the continent to also see like which of these opportunities for collaborations work the best for the goals that we have in mind, you know. But for people outside looking inwards, it's definitely an opportunity for collaboration and, you know, to build new relationships across different verticals.
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Hope, I don't know if you have any thoughts on.
I mean, not really. I think it's been said. I think I would just hope that moving forward in this space with this recognition of the US retreating and other countries kind of beginning to fill the gap, that those countries will come to the table with a different mindset than historically they have had. And so come, you know, expecting excellence, expecting advancement, et cetera, and like leave the typical, you know, what people have been used to when they think about Africa, leaving that behind, because it is a new day, as she's stating, that all these amazing things are happening on the continent, and the rest of the world needs to catch up and wake up and understand that there are a lot of opportunities in Africa, but you can't come if you still think the way you were thinking, you know, before.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, yes, Jane.
Thank you. First, congratulations to the panelists. It's wonderful. It's good to see Ebele here. She used to work in the Africa program, so it's very exciting to see this panel, and great job. But my question is, when we look at the youth in Africa, let's look at what has been happening in some countries. The Gen Z uprising, like for example in Kenya last year. There's a lot of disenfranchisement with young people. They don't feel like government works for them. And so when the finance bill of Kenya was passed and it was going to tax them more, they took to the streets. And one of the things that was touched on earlier was on the role of technology and the young people. And I wonder if governments are doing enough to tap this talent right now, and maybe then to prod this question to this panel: should we be seeing like some structural changes in how governments are working with young people? And how should we even be approaching as those think tankers? What are some of these things that we should be trying to influence to ensure that young people get to be more involved in government? Because as she said, they're going to be the majority. Thank you.
Definitely. I think I want to add a little bit to Jane's question in referencing a recent report by the Institute for Security Studies, which found that over the last 15 years, the number of African climate migrants has risen by over 600%. And even with advancements in climate tracking technology and regional governance strategies, African governments are rarely prepared for the impacts of climate migration. So compounding with the impacts of climate migration and not being able to really withstand some of these issues that Jane mentioned, how do you think that, or why do you think that these gaps are happening, and how do you see the compounding crises that we talked about impacting the political trajectories of some of these countries and then their ability to navigate with their youth? Sarah, if you wanted to.
Sure. No, I think it's a really important point. I mean, the short answer is governments are doing a terrible job at incorporating youth voices, and I think, again, to go back to the Arab Spring, that's one of the reasons the Arab Spring happened, is because young people in particular didn't feel like their governments represented them. They felt a lack of dignity. And it wasn't just young people, there were older people as well. But I think one of the things that Tunisia did really well in the brief period that it was democratic was they had a youth quota in parliament. We don't see this in many places around the world, and I think it's a great idea. It did help, and we've seen gender quotas in a lot of places, which have proven to be very effective. And I think this idea of a youth quota is something that governments across the world could adopt. And then the other thing I think that we find, unfortunately, is that a lot of young people are really involved in civil society, but they don't then take those skills and put them into government. So I did a lot of interviews with Tunisian revolutionaries several years ago, to say what happened. You were in the streets, you brought about a revolution, but then you don't want to be in politics and you hate the politicians and you hate political parties, what's going on? And I think that there's a lot that needs to be done to, first of all, build trust between politicians and civil society, but then also to teach the skills of consensus and coalition building that aren't necessarily the skills you need to carry out a revolution, but are the skills you need to govern. And there's a big gap that still exists, I think, in a lot of places there.
That's really interesting. I think that the trust bit is also very important. I'm not sure that a lot of young Africans have that trust in their governments in those spaces in order to enter into them with confidence and really apply the skills that you mentioned. Ebele, I don't know if you have thoughts on this. This is really your expertise area here.
Sure. I feel a lot of times when uprisings happen, people will always view them from the negative point of view. But I think that uprisings are really a good opportunity to really build trust. So, for example, Dr. Munga mentioned the fact that in Kenya, the youth took to the street because of the finance bill that was passed. I think in a situation like that, it's really important to see what was the key message, what was really the message of the youth, what were they trying to say, and why were they trying to say it, and how can policies, how can the government make more structural policies that actually address that change? I think that when the youth see that, government officials are really interested in learning what they have to say, people just don't take to the street for no reason, right? So I think there has to be kind of some certain level of creativity that goes into taking out the key messages from uprisings like this and then making structural changes. Of course, changes, sometimes they take longer than the short run, but there has to be that commitment that's really followed by real and implemented real work, that the youth can see and they can feel. And with regards to the climate crisis, I'm also going to share a few data points with us. The first thing is that the climate crisis, it caused a 600% displacement in migration populations within Africa, right? But it's not just an African problem. You know, all around the world, we are seeing issues with regards to the projections that climate change might have across the globe. For instance, it's projected that by 2049, there will be a 19% wage drop that's linked to climate change. But also in more developed economies like Australia, we see a 22% drop in crop profit that's also linked to climate. So in as much as like Africa is also facing these issues, you ask what the problems are. The first problem I would say is lack of data, which I've already explained in some of my other responses. The second one I would say is linked to the third, which is climate financing and climate infrastructure. Because a lot of African countries are grappling with competing development needs, countries have to, for instance, focus on investing in healthcare, but also investing in education and agriculture. And now there comes climate change where they also have to invest in this. So it's like when they try to prioritize a lot of times, it then seems as if climate change is getting the shorter end of the stick, right? But then, of course, what are the solutions? What can we do better? In the first place, institutions like the African Development Bank recently, in 2023, raised the 125 billion climate finance in collaboration with other multilateral development banks. And there's also like a climate investment fund that's about 1.05 billion or so that's also been earmarked for about 43 green infrastructure projects. So these are some of the ways, but also in terms of what the governments are doing, there have also been more like climate sensitive financing and budgeting, but also using data to better target the people who are affected by climate crisis to ensure that we're able to respond quickly when crises like this emerge.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning those specifically. I know many Africans have a lot of issues with the African Union and what they are or aren't doing, but there seems like there is some things that the African Union are doing and other development banks and things that are actually happening on the continent. So thank you for pointing some of those out. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to our last question, which is going to kind of bring all of this together and ask for some recommendations and ideas from our panelists. So referencing the African Union again, they are currently trying to expand resources to youth through offices like the Youth Envoy, which advocates for the voices and interests of African youth relevant to African Union bodies. So I wanted to ask our panelists, what are your recommendations to the African Union? What are your recommendations to African youth and youth on the continent when it comes to overcoming some of these structural, environmental, economic, academic challenges that we've discussed throughout this panel? If you want to go right down the line.
Great. This is a challenging question. I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of different things. I mean, one thing, the idea of a youth envoy is great, but I worry a lot about like youth washing, you know, appointing these sorts of positions. This goes back to the quota point I made earlier, where quotas can be great, but they have to be followed up by something else. And so making sure that when you give youth a seat at the table, it's not just a seat and then you're ignoring them, you know. So I think for youth, make your voice heard, you know, be persistent. It is an uphill battle to make sure that people take you seriously, but building those coalitions that we were talking about, using technology, different things like that to help amplify your voice and to work together, both within your own country, but across borders, I think really, really helps.
Absolutely, thank you.
I mean, I don't disagree with any of that, and it's hard to not repeat what you just said, but I will just say that sometimes, and this is to the African Union, sometimes you need to just let the youth lead. And I think that, like, I see in our students at Howard, you know, I like to think I'm still young, I'm still a youth. I am not, but I have to remind myself that I'm not, and then get out of the way. And like, I have, you know, my way of thinking about things and how things are supposed to be. And then I stop and talk to my students, and I'm like, oh, no, let me just be quiet over here, because you see it a different way, and you have a different approach, and you're thinking about it in a way that I had not considered. And so I think that, you know, when you amplify that, if not all the time, like she said, like there has to be some support, but a lot of times I think if we could all just be quiet and listen to the youth, it would be, I think we could, if we could actually hear them, it would make a big difference.
Absolutely. Really?
And in addition to what Sarah and Dr. Hope have said, to the African Union, I would say we need simpler systems. We need systems that reflect reality. And we need to inculcate more social or socioeconomic values into our educational system so that we raise politically conscious and, you know, community-minded individuals. And to the African youth, I would say our resilience is our resistance, our difference makes us stronger, and community brings us together. So, you know, like I said, we are very diverse, and we should just all continue along the path that our strengths allow us, and hopefully we get the Africa that we dream of in our generation.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Took the words right out of my mouth. That was great. Wonderful way to end that. I do want to thank all of my panelists, and I want to invite the audience to thank all of my panelists today. Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We'll now move into a slightly longer coffee break before we return right here for our keynote speaker at 4 p.m. So please make sure you're in your seats promptly and ahead of time. Thank you.